So as people begin to trickle into this conversation, I wanted to thank everyone for being here today and being able to join us in this session about identity and storytelling, sponsored by Impact Travel Alliance and Wonderful. If we haven't connected before, my name is Sophia Heider-Hawk. Again, I see everyone is introducing themselves in the chat, which is what we want to have today, have a very lively discussion. Some quick notes. This event is being recorded and it will be available for 48 hours for everyone. If you want to go back and hear some of the tips, some of the conversation that we're going to have today. If you're a media network member for Impact Travel Alliance, you will have lifetime access. You should have access as well to closed captions if you'd like to turn it on. Let us know if you have any issues on that front. For anyone that's not already familiar with Impact Travel Alliance, we are a global community and nonprofit, and our goal is to improve the world through travel. We do this in a way that helps travelers learn how to explore the world in a way that has a positive impact on local communities, cultures, wildlife, and the environment. Our media network is an alliance of about 100 content creators and rising thus far who share stories, blogs, social media content, videos, and so much more about their sustainable travel experiences, so that other travelers can learn from experiences and we can learn from each other. We started the series of online events that get into the business of being a content creator to support our media network and others like them. And today, as you know, we're talking about identity and storytelling and what that means through a sustainable travel lens. We are so very lucky to have our speakers with us today. We have Sojourner White. She is an international social worker by profession and travel content creator by passion, who curates the blog Sojourneys. I'd like to say that I get tongue twisted sometimes, so I'd love for Sojourner to have to explain a little bit more about our blog in a little bit. Sojourner's travel experiences as a Black American woman and professional social worker background inspired her travel education series, Let's Unpack That. The down-to-earth episodes unpack, and that pun is intended, the nuances of travel privileges, social identity, and responsible travel in a social media-driven world. We also have Justine Abigail Yu. She is a communications and marketing strategist who has worked with organizations operating in North America, Central America, East Africa, and Southeast Asia. Her expertise lies in growing enterprises from the ground up through strategic digital marketing, compelling storytelling, and genuine community engagement through a lens of anti-oppression. She is also the communications director at Wonderful, a global travel and lifestyle brand that specializes in helping all women travel the world. She's also a senior advisor at the Rise Travel Institute, a nonprofit organization that promotes responsible, sustainable, and ethical travel through education. She has another accolade that I'd like to share as well. She's the founder and editor-in-chief of Living Hyphen, an emerging magazine that explores the experiences of living in between cultures as a hyphenated Canadian. That is an individual who calls Canada home, but it also has roots somewhere else. It's a conversation I remember having with Justine when we first met, and it just sparked all these different discussions actually about identity as well. If we haven't met before, my name is Sophia Heider-Hawk. I am an ITA Media Network member and the founder of Papilia, a company that's committed to improving diversity, equity, and inclusion practices for destination travel organizations and content creators through tailored strategic development, training, and coaching services. I always love to share that I'm also a yoga and meditation instructor, and I integrate wellness ideologies into all the DEI work that I do. and design as a holistic way to be more aware, help people be more aware of their own identities as a means to connect with people in a meaningful way. Now we have a little bit of intros. There's conversation that's taking place in the chat, which is fantastic. I'm going to stop taking precious time away and dive right into today's discussion. For those that are attending, I ask that if you have any questions, there is the Q&A chat box below. So please feel free to ask questions. We will have a question and answer session towards the end. Continue your chats as you have them. We'll be monitoring that as well. All right, ladies. I'm going to dive right in. We have 3 parts that I'm excited to talk with you today. The first is just discussing who you are, your identities, or have that discussion because I'm very curious to learn more about you. Part 2, we'll be talking a little bit more about your identities as a storyteller. And then lastly, part 3, I have questions for you, some tips and tools for storytellers with respect to their own identities and how they tell stories. So my first question for you, maybe we'll start with Sojourner, is how do you identify yourself?
Yeah, so hi everyone, thank you for being here. No matter where I go or what I do, I identify as a Black woman. Like that is the bare minimum. That is, I see that as one identity just because of the way that I see the world and that I move through the world. Being Black and being a woman they're together, they're not separate in my eyes. And so that's like my primary identity. I think when we talk about travel, my US Americanness is definitely something that I'm more salient of outside. Outside of the US. It's not something that I feel as tied to when I'm in the US, but once I travel, I'm definitely with passport privilege and having a blue and gold passport. I know the power kind of in that, but I would say, I identify as a Black woman, my sister, daughter, all of those things as well, a foodie as well. But when it comes to identity, my Blackness and my womanhood are one in my eyes.
Interesting. And I know that I just started just dive right in, but I wanted to make sure that we had this discussion just to really lay the foundation for what we'll be discussing. Justine, how about you?
Yeah, so I guess from baseline as well, I identify as a Filipina Canadian. And, I often, when I hear that question of how do you identify, I always revert specifically to culture, ethnicity, because I find that, because of how I look, that's what people are trying to find out. But of course, there are other intersections of my identity that I think is really important and that shapes how I move through this world, how I work, how I live, how I play, which is that I'm a cis woman, I'm straight, I am able-bodied, middle-class, educated woman. So I think that a lot of those pieces also really play a big role in, again, how I move through this world, which we can, I guess, unpack and untangle a little bit more.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I like, I think it's so interesting with identity because the way I see it, I identify as a first generation American of Bengali and American heritage. So there's all the hyphens that come with that from the discussion that we've had before. But I also factor in the fact that I'm a mom now, which is a fairly new thing that has changed my perspective in a lot of ways. I also, when I think of identity, I also think of height because I'm a fairly petite and a small person. And that affects a lot of perceptions that are upon me and my points of view. And age is something else that is something I identify as well, because sometimes I look younger than I am. And I think it's just very interesting that I get treated differently because of the way I look from an age perspective. So it's really interesting that we all think of, identities in a different way. I'm curious, when we've talked about the different identities that we have, how did you discover these identities about yourself? Sojourner.
We could, yeah.
I say I don't know who wants to go first.
I know.
Yeah. Oh, I feel like for me, like being born and raised in the US, like my Blackness has always been something that I've just known. Like you just kind of like we're taught it. And so through like my culture and stuff like that, something how I knew, like, in being a woman, like eventually when mom sat me down, I was like, okay, this thing is gonna come and you're gonna have to go, and your period's gonna come, and all these things like about womanhood and what it meant to be a woman, like slowly but surely came out. But I think like the language around like being a cisgender woman, when it comes to like ability status, all of those things I understood, but I didn't name until I got older because they weren't things that were as readily discussed. I think when I think about my ethnicity, being Black in the United States, like we're labeled African American. But when I travel, when I would say I was African American, people would then ask me what part of Africa I was from, which given our history is like, well, considering colonization, I don't really have that history. So then once I got older and started traveling internationally, understanding like what it means to be Black American and African American, and like the importance of language and how that influences how I identify racially and ethnically when I'm traveling, because I personally do not like being asked what part of Africa I'm from, because it is a very heavy question to be asked by random people, which they're curious, right? But it's kind of part of the discovery where you learn like, actually, I don't want to talk about that. Like, I don't really want to kind of go into that history. So a lot of it was like told to me and I learned younger, but I think the more I traveled, the more I was more, my other identities kind of came out more, and just understanding what it meant to be a cisgender woman, to, not have to worry about my ability status, because I am someone who's not living with a disability at all. And so kind of over time, it's just changed the more I've traveled and more I've met people who weren't from the US as well.
Yeah, for me, I think it's similar in the sense that it's a constant evolution, and I'm constantly learning about my identity. And being Filipina, being Canadian is the obvious. It has always been obvious. One, I was born in the Philippines, so I was born in the Philippines and I moved to Canada when I was just 4 years old, but have always returned home to the Philippines every summer or every other summer. Still have family there, I still feel very rooted in my Filipino heritage and roots and things like that, which is a lot of why I've started the community that I have started. But a lot of the other pieces have been very recent, like Sojourner, what you said about being a woman, I think is something that it was always the norm, like these conversations around being cis or trans, it's even the concept or terminology for cis is something that I probably only learned maybe 5-7 years ago, like fairly recently, and so as we're having more conversations, as more diverse voices are coming to the forefront, I'm learning a lot about all of these different identities, and as a result also learning about my own identity, and learning about this term of being an able-bodied woman is something maybe in the last 2 years I've only discovered, because we live and function in such an able-bodied world, something that is built for us as able-bodied folks, that I didn't even see disability in my everyday life. And so that's something that I'm still personally learning. I could talk about this forever, to be honest, but like even from a cultural perspective, I still don't, for example, claim to be Chinese, which is part of my heritage. My last name is Yu. And so I definitely have Chinese blood. My grandfather is actually from China, fled communist China, and fled to the Philippines to escape communism there. But it's not something that I readily identify as, because it's just not something that I grew up with. It's not until I started my work with Living Hyphen, and my dad, it's his father who is Chinese, was sort of he was offended that I dropped the Chinese in my identity, and he's like, why did you do that? Why do you always say you're Filipino Canadian? Look at your last name. Look at how you look at your family, look at this. And so that has actually been something that we're negotiating together. When I returned home to the Philippines a couple of years ago, suddenly my dad was showing me, the Buddhist temple that he and his father always returned to, always went to on the weekends. He was showing me all of these parts of his identity that he never shared with me. But now that I've named it, he's suddenly like, oh my gosh, don't forget this part of yourself, which I think is really, really interesting. So anyway, it's a constant evolution. So I love acknowledging that identity is not static. It's not something that, like you were saying, Sophia, that now as a mother, that's something maybe not new anymore for you, but it's something that is different, that changes over time, right? Even age changes over time. So I just love that framing of it, that it is something that is constantly moving.
Right. It is. It's a constant for me. It's exactly the same. I see it in the same way. It's a constant evolution that I'm learning so much about myself every day. And it's that adaptation framing, like, oh, I didn't think, I think of privilege in a sense, right? Like there are things that I always think that no one has 100% privilege and no one has 0% privilege. We all have different forms of privilege that I'm starting to be aware of. Able-bodied being one. I remember honestly going, pushing a stroller down the street, and I'm thinking, there are no cuts in a sidewalk. Where are the sidewalks? What if, when I'm traveling, how is this going to work when something is so rocky? How can someone get, to experience this great, this great scene? So it's interesting. And I think about different aspects of my identity. I also think what's interesting, and you mentioned name, Justine, is my name is Sophia Hyder Hawk. You have no clue that I am of Bengali descent because my name sounds like it's German. And so it's really interesting that, people hear even my tone in my voice, if they're on a phone call with me, not a Zoom call. This was pre-video and Zoom days. And we would meet in person, and they'd be looking around for Sophia Hyder then. I'm like, this is me, and it's just the perceptions that we have. And I also think, we'll get into this question that I have for you in a second about travel. But I think of my identities that I have and perceptions of my identity as I travel. So with that, I want to ask this question about travel. How do the identities that you identify with have an impact on your travel experiences? And Justine, why don't you take that one this first go around?
I think for me, part of my identity that always comes to the forefront when I am travel is the fact that I'm a woman. And gender, I think for me more than race is what comes up. And, just being a lot more wary of where I go and what streets I take and how I travel. That threat of against my safety is always ever present when I am traveling, even when it is, a quote unquote safe place, whatever that means, but like a conventionally or whatever the mainstream media portrays as a safe place, it's still constantly in the back of my head, like I know I'm a woman, I know the potential for violence or rape or whatever it is, sexual assault is always there. And so that for me is always prevalent in deciding where I go and how like what mode of transportation I take or anything like that. Yeah.
Interesting. How about you, Sojin?
Yeah, I would say it's a mix of race and gender. Like I'm always conscious of when I go somewhere, okay, like where are the other Black people? Like I'm just always, and sometimes I book a place, I'm like, well, a probability of me going to somewhere in like Eastern Europe and there being a lot of Black people is pretty low, right? But if I'm in like a big city like Berlin or something, I'm always super conscious of like, okay, like I see, a mix of people, but I don't see a lot of Black people. So kind of like, where do they hang out? Like where are the Black owned businesses in certain destinations, just because I want to support. And also I enjoy learning about other people across the diaspora, because I know like Black is a very overarching term. And so understanding the nuances of like ethnicity and nationality and within Blackness, I'm always fascinated to meet. Like when I was in Amsterdam, met up with some Black Dutch women to talk to them, because like, yeah, we're Black, but we live on 2 different continents. So just kind of, connecting with them. So I'm always interested in that aspect when I travel. And then kind of what Justine was saying about being a woman, like I have my eyes and ears out at when I'm at home, like naturally. So I get to even amplify it more, especially when I solo travel, right? Just kind of being mindful of that, because for me, race and gender, like anti-Blackness and sexism are like intertwined for me when you talk about like intersectionality. And so just understanding that they work together. And sometimes I know a lot of people say, well, you're still American. I'm like, yeah, but people don't know that by looking at me. Like I'm not what they normally see in the media when I think of the United States. And so they're like, yeah, but you're American, you'll be fine. I'm like, yeah, if I open my mouth and start speaking English, right, then they're like, oh, okay, kind of in most cases. But I get questioned about my ethnicity more. Like I know people talk about like racial ambiguity, but when I travel, it's like an ethnic ambiguity, because they're just like, are you from like Latin America? Are you from like Africa? Like they just kind of place me anywhere that is not the US. And so it's just, yeah, it's all just kind of fascinating to meet people and just kind of assume where they think I'm from. And then once we kind of get talking, they're like, oh, wait, I actually didn't know a lot about Black American culture and stuff. And so it ends up being good conversations, thankfully, for the most part. But I would say my race and gender and ethnicity, I guess, for that matter heavily impacts my travel.
It's very interesting because as you both speak about your experiences and perspectives, I think I'm very much the same when it comes to identity and travel experiences. I've lived in quite a different places. And I used to live in California. I looked like I was Mexican, so I would kind of meld in, whatever that means. And now that I'm in the Atlanta area, I don't as much. So it's interesting. I think about that from a safety perspective as well. And then when I go overseas, depending upon where I go, I can just fit right in until I open my mouth, and then I sound completely different. So I think about that too from a safety perspective, from being able to assimilate from a look standpoint, and making sure that I respect the culture based on what I wear. But then from a safety aspect, obviously being of looking like I'm female, it brings on that safety aspect too, which is always a concern that I have in wherever I travel. So it's very interesting to be able to think about travel experiences based on the way we look and even feel. So, we talked a little bit about, if your identities have changed over time. Has that changed, as you think about your travel experiences and your identities, has anything changed for you as you think about the change of identity and you think about travel? Does anyone, Justine, do you have any thoughts, perspectives?
Thinking. So Sojourner, if you have.
Yeah, I can go. Just repeat the question. It was, how has it changed over time, like our identities?
Right, like when you travel, and I'll give you an example. Again, like as being a mom, I've noticed that I'm mama bear now when I travel. And my utmost thing is to make sure that, my son is safe. And so that is something I never would have thought about before. Was always about me. And so now it's about, okay, let me make sure whenever I travel, personally in the southeast part of the United States, that we are stopping for gas in a place that I need to make sure that my son is safe. So it's something that I'd never thought about before, and it's a new part of my identity. So I'm just curious if you have any experiences as you think about how your identities have changed, and how that relates in the context of travel.
Yeah, I think for me, I kind of mentioned it earlier, like the language around being African American or Black American, just because like I didn't realize like the assumptions people made when they heard African American. And so I'm really conscious about the language that I use and how I identify myself, which I think, well, Justine talked about it with your Chinese ancestry, but like older generation Black people don't necessarily like the phrase Black American because it erases our like history, like of like the transatlantic slave trade and like how we all got to the United States. And so it's interesting because I use Black American more when I'm traveling, and to get more specific, like Black US American, just because I think American, like there's also North America and South America, like we're not the only like America. So I think my language has gotten more specific, especially with my ethnicity, just because when you think about like someone who wasn't raised in the US context, it doesn't make that much sense. Like if you're from here and you kind of know the terminology we use, like it's familiar, but those language nuances have definitely changed over time and has impacted like my travel writing and blogging and the way I talk about stuff on social media. I'm very specific about who I'm talking about and how I'm talking about myself as well, because I want to show like I'm the expert in my experience as a person doing these things. And so I think it's made me more conscious of the language that I use too.
Took me a while to think of an answer to this question because I was like, what is it like to travel again? It's been so long.
Right.
Like, what did I do before? No, I think for me, one of the biggest changes in identity is I now have a partner. And previously, like in my early 20s, single girl, traveling solo or with a girlfriend, very different, awesome experience. But in the last few years, I have been doing a lot more travel with my partner, who is a cis, white, able bodied white man. And that has been a revelation of an experience to travel with him, to be honest. He was working in Vietnam for a couple of years and we were doing long distance. And so I would travel to Vietnam with him, or to visit him, and we would travel around quite a bit. And honestly, I have been able to do a lot more traveling and spontaneous and adventurous things, I think, at least for me. I can't speak for everyone, obviously, but more than I would have been able to do by myself as an Asian woman. He just picks up and goes. Like he'll go on Google Maps and he will be like, oh, look, this is a cool bridge. Let's go. And I'm like, oh my God, like, do you want to check what neighborhood that is in? Is it a tourist spot? Is it this? Is it that? But he's just like ready to go, And I'm like, oh wow, what is it like to be you? I always remember there's this one time when, we were out at a restaurant one evening and wanted to go to a bar that he loves in Saigon. And so we were walking there and he found an alleyway that was a shortcut to this bar. Dark, dimly lit, like no one was there. And I was just like, no. We got to go around to like, the main intersection, very well lit and everything. He was like, why? That'll take us like 20 more minutes to get to this place. It's right there. And I was like, oh my God, like my anxiety was through the roof. But being with him, I did feel safer. I was with a man, I was with a white man. And so I felt safer going through this alleyway. And it did take us, it was so much faster than going all the way around. And after that experience, I told him, I was like, wow, you know, this is such an emblematic example of what it is like to be a woman versus a man, where like we have to go around, go the long way, not just in travel, but in freaking everything, you know, like in all aspects of life, we have to go the long route to get to a certain place. And so that's one of the experiences that really highlighted for me the privilege of my partner and the privilege of being with a person of different privileges, you know? So that's the biggest way I feel like my experience or my identity has changed in travel.
Interesting. I saw when you mentioned dark alleyway, I saw Sojourner's face. She was like, oh gosh.
No way.
There is no way I'm not going to any dark alleyways. I will take the extra 20 minutes because there's no way.
That's so, it's so interesting you brought that, because I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, I would never, that just is something that would never cross my mind, just to take this shortcut, because everything else that I'd factor in to that decision is so different.
Yeah, for sure.
So when it comes to, I'm curious about, you know, sustainable travel initiatives. So how do your identities intersect with sustainable travel initiatives? Just adding another layer to what we've been talking about.
Yeah, I can go because I am not the poster child for sustainable travel. I'm not even like, it's definitely something that I'm learning about more and more. And I think about it, like just sustainability as a whole and like the whole environmental justice space. A lot of it is predominantly white people who are normally the face of like sustainability and like all of these things. And so I guess for a long time, I never really realized how my identity is connected to sustainability. But then like my mom, she actually runs a 2-acre urban farm here in Milwaukee. And so like through her work, like I've come to realize like, oh, we've always had sustainable practices. I just didn't know that was like the term for it. So again, language, and like once you can name something, you're like, oh, that's what that is. Like that's why like the country crock pot was never actually had butter in it. It had like spaghetti because like we were reusing things. And so once I could put it at the small scale, I could then understand it largely, like with travel. And I'm still very new to all the terminology. I do not pretend to be expert in sustainable travel, but understanding like the impact of flying and like all of like plastic and all of those kinds of things has been kind of a learning experience for me. But now that I see more and more people, like Black and brown people, talking about sustainability, it's like, okay, this is something that like, yes, we are a part of, like, and we have been doing these things for generations. It's just, especially with think about like Black people in the United States, you know, that was part of slavery, was like you were out working the fields and like all, like we were at one point teaching ourselves about the land, like lay of the land, and eventually that got lost. But once again, putting all those connections to history and like at the small scale, and like, okay, and traveling is like, okay, maybe not catching flights on Ryanair like every weekend was the thing to do, but like all of those little things, just trying to figure out what that means when travel is like how does that even work for someone who wants to go to a different country, but like flying is the only way really to get there. So I guess for me, it's not really about solutions at this point. It's more, I have a lot of questions about sustainable travel and kind of what it looks like in the future from like an environmental perspective.
So Jonah, it's so funny that you mentioned that about like the small things that your family or that your mom does that is already sustainable. I remember I saw like, it was like a tweet trend that's like, name something that's classy if you're rich, but ghetto if you're poor.
Mm-hmm.
And poor being, I think in this, in the tweet trend, just being a shorthand for racialized, to be honest, where it's like, if you're reusing something, it's upcycled, you know, and you can like charge extra for it. Whereas like, when I look at my family, we've been reusing yogurt containers and like takeout containers forever, or like you have, oh my gosh, there's so many different things. But anyway, it just made me think of that the way we think about sustainability has traditionally been white. I think that I have also not been as plugged into that conversation because I see it as a white dominated space and something that is more expensive almost, you know, like to buy something that is sustainable and ethical is more expensive, but it doesn't have to be. And it, you know, doing simple actions like recycling or upcycling is something that my family has always been doing, but we just don't recognize it as such. But in terms of like travel in general, I don't know if my cultural side plays as much into the sustainability aspect, more so like, I don't even know if it's identity, but from like a career standpoint, I have found myself in more ethical and sustainability circles. Like I've been working in the nonprofit space for a very long time. And so that has really influenced the way I think about my travels and the way I just behave. So I don't know if it's specifically identity. Like I don't want to chalk it up to that, but
I think these are great points. I think when it comes to sustainable travel, again, it can be such a loaded term, and then it can also mean nothing at the same time because it means something different for everyone else. And I think what's interesting is you're right, very much. Both of you are so on point when it comes to thinking of that's this big thing that is, you know, it costs a lot of money, and carbon emissions, and what does that mean? And the connection that I always try to make is exactly what you both mentioned of what am I doing already that hasn't been categorized as sustainable travel. You know, and I think about what I typically like to do is bring my water bottle
right.
with me. I've always done that because it's what I do. And I think about, you know, how am I able to reduce how much I pack? How do I make sure that, you know, I'm being very aware of how much I take with me? What are my little reusable containers that I can use so I'm not having to use things if I'm having to go to a hotel. And so maybe it's a matter of making it more, you know, feeling more accessible for the typical traveler, and not so up, you know, up in the ether of philosophical, you know, what it needs to look like. So these are some really good points. So I brought up a little bit about travel planning. So how do your identities have an impact on your travel planning process? Whoever wants to go first.
I can go. I think for me, so one of my favorite things that I've found is like joining Facebook groups, like travel Facebook groups, because they can be a lot sometimes, right? But they are like a wealth of knowledge, and thankfully they're like a lot of like Black travel groups, and I've been able to kind of join those, kind of see where other Black travelers are going and kind of their experiences, which I think has been really helpful. And I do some research before. I think like a viral tweet early on in the pandemic was like being Black is like Googling, like, is there racism in the destination you're going to or something like that. And so like, I definitely look up, I'm like, so Black people in blank, like, you know, just to see if anybody has shared. And again, you take it like with a grain of salt, because as Justine mentioned, safety is very subjective. And so what was safe for one person may not be safe for you, even if you do share the same identities, right? But I enjoyed like looking, and now after like last June, it was like tons of information on like Black owned businesses in places around the world. You had Martinique Lewis, who did the new Green Book, which I bought instantly because yes, like I'm hoping those places are still going to be here like after the pandemic, you know, but I definitely want to use that and kind of go to those spots. So I definitely do some research beforehand in addition to kind of just feeling it out just to see. But I definitely search like Black owned things in certain destinations just to kind of support where I can, because it's fun and I like it.
Yeah, I think for me, that's largely a lot of where my planning comes from is finding, you know, those Asian owned, Black owned, like underrepresented
Mhm.
folks who own businesses in these, different places. I think that has been over the last few years, definitely not in my earlier travels. I didn't care so much then, or didn't even think about that back then. But now it's something that has been really heightened for me, and something that I always think about, just like how can I support those businesses or those organizations, tour companies, whatever it is. And I think um, even from like a sustainability perspective, like making sure that I am supporting these local businesses is really important to me, as opposed to like bigger chains, especially when I'm going to Asia, for example. Like that's like where I'm from, and I don't want to just support these big box hotels or companies where the money is being filtered back into the West, into the country that I might originally be from, like living in. So that's been really important for me as well. I will say that I think from like a safety standpoint, that's where a lot of my privilege comes in, where I don't have the same experience as you, Sojourner, where, yeah, like as an Asian woman, I don't think that threat to safety is as heightened. I have definitely experienced racism and like sexualization as an Asian woman, especially I'd say when I'm traveling to Europe, but it hasn't been something that has pushed me to like check in on safety of a particular place. It has been few and far between. And I think that, again, that's a part of my identity that is more privileged.
Interesting. As you speak, I think about international travel and I think about domestic travel. And we're doing a lot of, and those two are very different and on how I plan. Right now we're doing a lot of domestic travel because of the current situation, and because I don't feel comfortable, taking a toddler on a plane yet. And when I'm in the southeast part of the United States, I do a lot of planning on safety, thinking about the routes that I'll be taking, and driving. And I do research on the tourism board website to see how I feel, the type of imagery that's on there, the type of wording. And then I do research on blogs. Again, just saying, what does it feel like? Do I feel like I'm going to be safe? Is Mama Bear going to feel safe? And it's really interesting. I'm very hyper aware of that. At the same time, I also, with the road trips, I try to stop at like local fruit stands if I can, or local markers, or I'll do a little, if I see some of the craft shops, I try to be able to support that as well. But something recently that I learned recently, if you are taking a road trip, always make sure that you get your oil changed, and your tires are at the right air level, whatever it's called, because it actually saves on fuel and it helps with the economy as well. So a little sustainability tip when you're road tripping.
Can I add to that too, Sophia, about the domestic versus international? Because like sundown towns is something that I learned, like, I think I was in elementary, middle school. And so just understanding, which I don't know if Canada technically I don't know Canada's history, but these are towns pretty much like if the sun went down, Black people wouldn't be safe in these towns. So that when you mentioned, Sophia, the difference between domestic and international, like I never looked it up internationally, but in the US, like when it was shut down and like I was traveling even around Wisconsin up here up north, like there are some places where I was like, so let me look up like the history of these places. Like, and I did some hiking outdoors, which outdoor travel is a whole other area of like identity and whether or not Black and brown people are represented like enough in that space. But just understand like, hey, we're gonna stop in this town because it has a lot of people, like, and planning out, where we're gonna stop and kind of what time of day we're gonna go, because that's still a threat. May not be as visible as much as it used to be, but it's definitely something I thought about a lot when everyone was talking about road trips in the pandemic. I'm like, there's a reason why we drove from my house to my grandma's, like in Louisiana, with stops in big cities. Like there was, that there was a lot going on there. So.
Absolutely. Thank you for adding that. And this is an interesting part now of thinking about storytelling, and you both are storytellers. So thinking about what we've talked about today, which the conversation I wish was like 3 hours plus, but it's not. How do you incorporate your identities into your travel writing, and even as you pitch stories and create stories, given the conversation we've had today and then some?
Mm-hmm.
Justine, go ahead.
Yeah, I think for me, when I pitch stories, so much of my writing is just wrapped up in my identity as a hyphenated Canadian, as Filipina Canadian. I don't know, like it's just injected in everything that I do. I don't even think about it. I don't even know how to like articulate it right now in terms of it just comes so naturally, but like I always try to find the angle of something that is specific to me, right? And I am cognizant too when I'm writing stories or sharing stories, especially around travel, when it is my experience, that it is very specific to me. And I think that's something that we're seeing a lot more of, and there's more interest in like nuance and complicated stories. I think it's easy for us to be like, oh, an Asian writer, therefore she speaks for all Asian women or Asian people, which is so not the case. Like, to be Filipina is so different from being Vietnamese or Cambodian or all of the, like Asia's huge, right? And so I think for me, injecting that nuance, that specificity about who I am and like how I see the world is really what I try to bring to the table when I'm pitching or when I'm telling these stories, and not trying to speak for everyone and not being, general with what I write about.
Yeah, I would agree about being specific about this is my story. Like, I do not speak for all Black women. Like, yes, I identify as a Black woman, but I do not speak for everybody. This is just like my experience. And so I agree with the specificity. And I think before, like, to say you were like a Black travel blogger, like, was kind of weird to me at first, because it kind of showed that like being Black wasn't the default for like travel blogging. Like, people knew that there was a very specific brand of travel blogger, a travel content creator that was always like kind of at the forefront. But for me, like kind of what Justine said, I can't not talk about my identity when I travel. Like, it is just ingrained in kind of what I do. And it doesn't mean that every single post can be like, as a Black woman, I do these things. Like no, like that's tired. That's like extra emotional labor I do not want. But if there's experience that I want to share, like I'll say like, yeah, as a Black woman, this bothered me, or as a Black woman, this is kind of how it is. But I never wanted to be like all that I am either, because I think it's really easy for people to tell you like to niche down, like, but like being Black isn't a niche to me. Like, that's just who I am. And so like it's not. So, but I also like talk about food, like in outdoors, and like train travel, like all these other things that I love to do when traveling. Just I happen to be a Black woman doing them. And so it's a very thin line, kind of to balance, just because I want to be a whole person as well, who just loves to travel. But regardless, I'm a Black woman. Like, that's non-negotiable, and that's always the lens that I have.
Really interesting, because I think recently, right, in the past few years, I've been thinking about the kind of stories that I'm looking for. So it's the intersectionalities, the different lenses, people that have perspectives of like Indian American descent. And it's so interesting because I'm constantly looking for that. And what I like to always bring to the table is very similar. It's like, this is just who I am. This is my lens. I don't speak for all, but I can speak from the experiences that I've had through my different identities. But it's very interesting, at least for me, when I'm looking to actively, not just look for my niche, but I'm looking for the different lenses, because they're so different, and it's a fantastic way to understand the life of somebody else and a perspective of somebody else. So, so we've talked about ourselves and storytelling, what advice do you have for storytellers and writers who are curious to learn more about their own identities? And how would you suggest writers explore their own identities? Anyone can go first.
I would say travel, but we're in a still kind of a weird time. Like, I mean, if you want to explore your identity through travel, obviously, but I know I've had a journal since I learned how to write. And so sorry, our door is very loud. And so I would say start writing stuff down. I know people are like, I don't want to reflect. Yeah, you do. Like, I promise you, like, write. I'm not saying like you have to write a story about your life every single day, but just kind of start writing stuff down, because you can always come back to them. I have about 4 travel journals at this point that I just kind of keep with me, because I like going back and seeing what 20-year-old me in 2015 who left the country for the first time was processing, compared to 26-year-old me now, who I did my first like solo travel train trip last week, and I don't think I would have done that 6 years ago, right? And so I think you want to learn about yourself, document yourself, like, you don't need to have a social media platform to do that. You can just start writing stuff down as you travel to kind of process what you're going through.
I love that, because so for me, like with my community with Living Hyphen, we actually grew quite a bit this last year in facilitating writing workshops. And so I am a huge proponent of reflecting by, the written word. And, that has been really important for me. Like, I'm a writer myself, I'm a storyteller. So writing has always been for me the way to process and the way to reflect. And I think that's been really important for me and a lot of the people who have come through the Living Hyphen community, is exploring our identity. And again, this is specifically through a racial, cultural, ethnic lens. Of course, there are different intersections of identity, but this is my wheelhouse. And doing so in community with other people, I think has been a really powerful opportunity for a lot of us who have been doing this work to see and learn about different cultures and the different nuances, in South Asia. Like, Sophia, I've learned so much about like Bengali, Tamil, and India and Pakistan, and like all the area and like the partition and the history that is so complex. I don't even fully understand it yet. I'm just starting to learn about it now. Anyway, to learn about other people has helped me learn a little bit more about myself as well, which sounds maybe cliche, but it's totally true. So for me, writing is a huge part of that. For me, writing and reading. Reading for me is a part of travel. It is a form of travel, of being transported to a different world, to a different place. And it's a source of learning for me about different cultures and different people. We're seeing now, I think, more than ever, books and literature from folks of various intersecting identities. And I have been doing so much reading lately of just and learning about these different experiences that I will never have, to embody different bodies. And so writing and reading for me is a really powerful way to explore identity, especially right now when we can't travel, right? Or we're very limited in our ability to travel.
Right. I have so many more questions for you, but I'm looking at the time, and I'm going to ask you one quick question before we wrap up. Do you have, I have all these questions I want to ask you. So what should writers be aware of when they cover stories about different destinations? Do you have any tips or resources that you can offer them to create greater awareness, or to ensure that they offer different perspectives and lenses in their writing if they're covering a different culture?
So I'll make my answer short for this one, and I'm going to put on my wonderful hat, one of the sponsors of this event. I was the co-creator of an anti-oppression toolkit for travel creators, and I'll drop the link here. And we put together really like a number of different resources on how to write about other cultures that are not your own, how to take photos in a way that is responsible and ethical and respectful of the communities that you're traveling to, different different aspects of the content creator experience. So I'll just drop that as a resource for you all to dive into, because that's a big question and there's so much to cover with that. So
thank you, Justine. How about you, Sojourner?
Dang, Justine had a whole toolkit. I'm sitting here thinking, oh, what am I gonna say? I think for me, I've just been reading more and more about what it looks like to decolonize travel. And so I've just been kind of researching kind of what that looks like language-wise as someone who does do travel writing and blogging. I would say too, as like a travel writer, I'm very conscious about the stories that I pitch and write, because if I don't feel comfortable talking about, like, if you feel any hint of like uncomfortability with the topic when you're covering other culture, maybe try to tweak it so that, again, it's about, you know, your expertise in that area, for like you are the right person to be writing it. I think a lot of times we get so caught up for people who are travel writing or blogging for like bylines and all these kind of things, that you kind of go for the clout sometimes, when really maybe you should pass over that story to someone else who is more equipped to write it. So I think, one, learn about our language and kind of how we need to change it to sound less colonizery is one thing, if that's a word. And then on the flip side, learning how to say, maybe I shouldn't be writing this, but maybe you know someone who is the right person who could write it. Maybe you interview them, you know, maybe change your pitch so that it's more tailored to be more culturally appropriate as well.
It's a very good tip. I have one quick tip as well, is, again, I love what you both have said, and thinking about the story, the lens, and to ensure that cultural appropriation doesn't take place. Thinking about, you know, actually maybe talking and interviewing is so important to ensure that that you're capturing different lenses. At least that's what I try to do in my writing. We are out of time. I really appreciate both, like, this conversation. I could go on and on, but I would love it if we could, ladies, if you have a link to how our audience can find you, because you have some great work that you do that I really would want to make sure is shared. We, you know, spoke about identity, storytelling, and really thinking about how you can understand your own identity as well. So again, this conversation is recorded and it's available for 48 hours. For those that are joining, for Media Network members, you have lifetime access. I really want to thank you, Justine. I want to thank you, Sojourner, and Impact Travel Alliance for helping this conversation take place. We have office hours next week on Thursday, August 5th, 12 to 12:30. I will be there if you have any other follow-up questions. And if you also have questions about our speakers today during office hours, I'm more than happy to share their information during that time. Any final words, my lovely panelists?
Thanks for having us. This was great.
Thank you.
Yes,
great.
Go on for hours.
Hours.
To be continued.
Thanks,
Thank you, everyone, for joining.